Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a members Chabura Shiur. Tonight we have with us your Yosef Zarnighian back for the second installment of our exciting series on the Ibn Ezra. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. Just a notice that our book, our new Sefer on Sefer Vayikra, but with the commentary of Chacham Amozeg, is currently on reduced price for the new Sefer, so take advantage of that. And with that, the floor is yours.
Buy and grab the Sefer. Chacham ben Amozeg's insights really are true gems in the path of Ibn Ezra and the great giants of Spain that followed in his footsteps. So, continuing in our Hakdama, our introduction to Ibn Ezra's Hakdama, his introduction to the Torah, we are on Haderech HaRavi'it, the fourth. So we mentioned in the last lecture how there are 5 paths of biblical interpretation that Ibn Ezra tackles that was most frequent, most common in his lifetime. And the fourth one, which he will take issue with, is the approach of the French rabbis or the Franco-German rabbis. He does so very respectfully, though, and I think this is a very important lesson for us nowadays. The differences among Ashkenazim and Sephardim are certainly not new to anyone with us tonight. We're all familiar with them. But what Ibn Ezra does, I think, is a very important lesson in that he addresses the differences with a great deal of respect and with a great deal of kavod shown to these great rabbis. So I'm going to share the source sheet so we can all look inside. Okay. And we're going to scroll down. The fourth path that Ibn Ezra is tackling, Keroba el Nekuda. If you all recall, the analogy that Ibn Ezra set for us in the beginning of the introduction was that of a circle with a dot in it. So if you were to draw a circle and everything within the circle is considered acceptable interpretation, whereas the truth or the most accurate rendition and elucidation of the Torah is the dot itself. So over here, Ibn Ezra is saying the fourth path is very close to the dot. It's not only in the circle, it's pretty darn close to the dot itself. Urdafu acharei aguda, and a multitude or a group of people that we will address in a second are those who seek it. They chase after it. And this is the methodology of the sages, the rabbis of Greece and of Edom. For those unfamiliar, Edom originally referred to the descendants of Esav and all those who were genetic descendants of his. As time evolved, Edom ceased to exist. And Josephus already in his Antiquities mentions the nation of Iduma, and the Edomites were really a failing and dwindling society on the outskirts of southern Israel. And they ultimately became associated with the Roman Empire and with, I guess, Western Europe as a whole. So in the lands of Greece and Edom, we will say European rabbis, for lack of better terms, Shelo yabitu al mishkal moznaim, who could not properly evaluate and ascertain the weight of measurements. That's his way of saying they were not very well versed in diktuk, in Hebrew grammar. Rak yaskimu al derash ve'lekach tov ve'or enayim. But what is agreeable to them are the homilies, the midrashim that were actually credited first, not to Rashi. People love crediting the introduction of midrashim and fill-in-the-blank stories of the parasha that we read every week to Rashi, but Rashi is not the first. Prior to Rashi, you had Chacham Tovia ben Meir, who was the composer, not the author. He was the composer of a midrash by the name of Lekach Tov. It's quite interesting, actually, to go through, because there are times where Lekach Tov cites midrashim that we no longer have. It's a favorite of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, alav shalom, in his Living Torah. If anyone here reads the Living Torah, I love looking at the footnotes on Shabbat. So he cites Lekach Tov often. The Or Enayim. Or Enayim is a lesser known midrash. It was written by a chacham by the name of Rabbi Meir Mikastoria of Greece. So these were the popular works of his time, which Ibn Ezra doesn't have any inherent problem with. That's why he says it's close to the dot, but it should not be our bread and butter. And the ones who make it their bread and butter have misplaced priorities, according to Ibn Ezra. ואחר שימצאו המדרשים בספרי הקדמונים, ולמה יגיעונו לכתובם שנית אלה האחרונים? He says, I already have the midrashim on my bookshelf. I don't need these rabbis to restate it for me. So he thinks it's redundant. Now the truth is, there's a method to the madness. All of the super commentaries, for example, the mefarshim on Lekach Tov, on Rashi, often love pointing out why what's bothering Rashi? That's the famous question. Why did Rashi choose this citation of the Midrash and not another? So that is, I think, perhaps a point that Ibn Ezra did not mention. Okay, but it's something that he still takes issue with. Veyesh derash hefech derash. Now, pay attention, because this is something that, unfortunately, many of us, at times, I will admit, even myself, are included in. And that is reading midrashim that are contrary to the midrash's intent. There are times where a person can read the midrash, and the way one is interpreting it defeats the entire purpose, or sometimes contrary to the intent of the midrash. And there's really a deeper meaning that is not explicit. There's a hint that the midrash, or hints that the midrash is alluding to, that real Talmid Chacham will pick up on, but not all of us are exactly capable or privy to those subtle allusions that some midrashim have. Kidrash HaTorah, Kidrash ShaTorah Kadma be'alpaim shana kodem ha'olam. This is a midrash in Bereshit Rabbah that says that the Torah was created before the universe was created by 2,000 years. Well, v'zeh emet. Ibn Ezra says, we're not denying, God forbid, what the Chachamim say. The rabbis of the Midrash spoke the truth. Rak al derech hayesod ha'ne'elam. But they were speaking by way of a hidden foundation. So they were speaking in, again, ways that even I'm not going to pretend to understand. I'm not pretending like I know what that means. But there is a deeper meaning behind the specific number 2,000. And there's also a specific reason why the rabbis chose to use the metaphor of the Torah being created before the universe. And many people don't understand that there is in fact, this hidden meaning. Thus, we must say that you cannot interpret this midrash at face value. He says it cannot be interpreted literally, because we have this thing called the observable universe. And in the observable universe, the years as we currently count them are linear. Time, the way human beings refer to and interact with time, is linear. And the measurement of specific time, which is minutes and hours and seconds and what have you, are counted by means of a revolving sphere. It is counted by means of sunrise and sunset, right? Sha'ot zemaniot. That's how we calculate specific time, or I should say daily time. V'im ein sham galgal en yom. And if there's no earth, if there's no rotation, then you cannot have days as we understand them. In other words, Ibn Ezra is saying the 2,000 years of creation prior to the universe where the Torah existed, physically, as human beings are capable of understanding, cannot be taken literally because there is no concept of time as we know it. There is no concept of day and night as we know it, and so on and so forth. והשואל, מה היה העולם בתחילה? הלא יתבייש למען שיבקש כי יש לעין יש? This is the famous non-starter question. So Ibn Ezra says, lest you ask then, what was in the universe prior to its existence? Ibn Ezra says, basically, don't ask stupid questions. Should you not be ashamed by asking such a question? Ki yesh le'ayin yesh, because there is the question assumes that there is substance that created nothingness, when in reality it's to be understood the opposite. The world was brought into existence from nothingness. That's a famous comment, Radak, by the way. Radak, in his Sefer HaSharashim, mentions or defines the root bara, Bereshit bara Elohim, as Beria yesh me'ayin, creation ex nihilo. So anytime you see this word bara in the Torah, with some exceptions, there are a few exceptions to the rule, but in general, it refers to a form of creation which was brought into existence from nothing. So that's why you'll almost never see that verb, that root, used by the creation of human beings. Like by human beings, you might see vayitzer or vaya'as, etc., etc. But you'll never see vayivra. Okay, the side point. V'hameshivim, but those who retort to this question and say shebara Hashem et haolam ba'et sheyada ki tov hu, gam zot hatshuva benuya al even bohu. Says there's another midrash that refers to the creation of the world as being brought about when God somehow, in some point in time, realized that it was good to do so, whatever that means. He says that's also built on a foundation of a nonsensical notion. וכן האומרים שבראו להראות גבורתו לאדם שהם שורש יצירתו. It says likewise, those who claim that God created the universe, the world, in order to show mankind his might and power, because man is in fact something which stems from his making. והנה שמו תשובתם המולה חלק קטן מהשאלה הגדולה. He says that they in fact place their this response is in fact placed as being a small part of an even greater question. Basically, that's Ibn Ezra's way of saying that the answer is circular. Because if you say that God created the universe in order to show mankind his greatness, because God created man and therefore we are inferior, you can immediately retort by saying, why does God need to show his greatness? Hello, God himself is not lacking. He doesn't need to show us anything. So Ibn Ezra is bringing all of these examples in order to demonstrate his method. And he goes on by saying, I'm going to skip a little bit. ויש דרש מספרה ידועה, ויש שהוא בהלכה שאיננה קבועה. He says that there are some midrashim that are based upon a known logic. Those are midrashim that rarely can be taken at face value. ויש שהוא בהלכה שאיננה קבועה. And there are those that are mentioned in the, it's a question what Ibn Ezra means over here. The way I understand it, he's referring to midrashay halakha. So these are not to be confused with the midrashim that are often quoted in Rashi, in other texts where they fill in the gaps in the stories of the Torah that are lacking. They're not homiletical, they're legal midrashim. So these are the midrashim that you will find in the Sifre, in the Sifra, in the Mechilta, and so on and so forth. And he says you also have to be careful when you're studying or citing midrashay halacha that can be taken at face value. Halacha is not cryptic. Halacha is it's straightforward. It has to be straightforward. But the Ibn Ezra says it's not necessarily a halacha kevu'ah, meaning it's not a binding opinion that's stated, and a person can be misled into thinking that this is a binding source when in fact it's not. גם יש דרש שהוא טוב לאחרים, וידרוך בדרך תבונה את הנערים. There are some midrashim that are good for some people, but it tramples and stomps upon the intellectual path of the youth. I think that's probably a category that many of us are familiar with, right? That you have some midrashim that can serve a very positive purpose for 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds, and then fast forward 20 years and you're in your mid-20s and the rabbi is parroting the same midrashim you heard in preschool, and it doesn't really sound all that appealing anymore, and it begins making you raise some very serious questions. So Ibn Ezra was also privy to this reality. You think this is a problem nowadays? It existed in his days too. Okay, and he gives you an example of this. He says there's a midrash, Sha'olam nivra bevet. Oh, that's a midrash in Bereshit Rabbah. The midrash asks, why does the Torah begin with the letter bet? Ba'avur beracha, because it wanted to begin with the first letter of beracha, which is bet. And Ibn Ezra says, Ve'im hadavar kacha, if you want to take this at face value, you got a big problem on your hands. He says, what's your problem? You have a pasuk in Yeshayahu which says, Bokeka aretz boleka, which is a curse upon the earth to be desolate. Not really good. That's not a beracha, right? And he gives you Va'ashitehu vata, another pasuk in Yeshaya of a cursed status of the Jewish people in exile, and that begins with the bet as well, and so on and so forth. He gives you many examples to the effect stating that stating first letters of pesukim, which are not blessed in nature, they're not berachot, they are, God forbid, kilalot. V'kadmonenu zichronam livracha ameru al kacha. Our rabbis of blessed memory, who are all aware of these midrashim, it's a passage that appears, I think, 4 or 5 times in the Gemara. They say, En mikra yotze mide peshuto. You cannot remove the verses of the Mikra from their straightforward meaning. That is a canon of interpretation which holds true even in light of a midrash, to the point where the Geonim, Rav Shemuel ben Chofni Gaon, Rav Hayeh Gaon, Rabbeinu Sherira Gaon, all have in various letters and teshuvot to the effect stating that if a midrash is incomprehensible to an individual, he can outright dismiss it. In other words, we don't necessarily say that the Chachamim were wrong. We're not disrespectful, but it's not my problem to worry about. My problem is to worry about the Peshuto Shel Mikra, the straightforward understanding of a verse in light of its grammar and context. And if you don't believe me, look at what Ibn Ezra does. Dirash Bereshit Batorah, regarding the midrash relating to the Torah being primordial, that's the word I was looking for, being first in creation, he says that's based on the pasuk in Mishleh, Adonai koneni reshit darko, that God acquired his first path of existence, so to speak, through Reshit, the first, which is an allusion to Bereshit, the Torah. Ibn Ezra says, acher. It doesn't mean what you think. It means something else. Ha'olam nivra Livyatan. Or the Midrash that says that the world was created upon this beast called Leviathan, Livyatan. Shne'emar hu reshit darche el. He says, Pasuk in Iyov, referring to the first form of interaction that God, so to speak, has with the universe, being upon Livyatan. He says, acher, that's something else. Doesn't mean what you think it means. Ha'olam nivra sheyir'u milefanav, or that the world was created in order for mankind to revere God. Kichen ketiv. We say this every mincha on Shabbat. Reshit chokhmah. What is the foundation of wisdom? Yirat Adonai. It's reverence of God. Acher. Again, all of the connections that the Midrash makes connects to the word Reshit. Reshit, Bereshit, right? So just like the Torah begins with the word Bereshit, the Midrash tries to draw an analogy. Why does it begin with Bereshit? Why does it begin with the first of something? It begins with the first of something, at the beginning of something, to show you that the Torah is the first in the hierarchy of the universe. And all these different examples are provided by the Midrash to demonstrate that. But the Ibn Ezra says, don't take it literally. It's not what you think it means, and so on and so forth. Or like the Midrash that says that the world was created for Bikurim. Shneemar, as the Pasuk says, Reshit 3 times. Reshit Bikurei Admetecha Tavi Beit Adonai Elohecha. That's also Reshit. But he says it's not what you think it means. It doesn't mean that the world was literally created so that human beings can bring Bikurim. It doesn't mean that the world was literally created just so we could revere God. Okay. So what's the takeaway over here? The takeaway is the Midrashim serve a very important purpose, and they serve a very advanced purpose, according to Ibn Ezra. The fact that their purpose is specific and advanced is, by its very definition, it places the Midrashim in a category that are not meant to be staples of our learning. The staple of our learning, as Ibn Ezra said, must be Peshuto Shel Mikra. And there's a point that I want to touch on that Ibn Ezra doesn't state explicitly, but it is expounded later on, a couple of hundred years later, by Ramban. Ramban, in his Perush al-Torah, sometimes takes issue with Ibn Ezra, as we mentioned last week. And one of the points that Ramban points out regarding that canon of interpretation, en Mikra Yoseh Mideh Peshuto, that the Torahs or the verses of Mikra cannot depart from their straightforward meaning. Ramban says it doesn't mean en Mikra ela Peshuto. The Chachamim were not saying that the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim can only be understood in light of their straightforward renditions. No, there are definitely added levels of interpretation. There's no question about it. Otherwise, our Chachamim would not have shared all of these different levels of interpretation in the Midrash and in other works which we have. But it cannot contradict. It cannot be motzi. It cannot remove the straightforward understanding of a verse. So that places us hopefully in a very humble place, knowing that next time we learn Rashi or other collectors and those who cite Midrashim, to really be analytical and careful when we study them, not to take them at face value necessarily. Before we go on to Haderech HaChamishit, are there any questions regarding the fourth path of Ibn Ezra? Okay, so the final path that he outlines for us, I did skip a little for the sake of time, because the rest of the examples provided for can go on, but that sums up the fourth path of Ibn Ezra. The fifth path, Mossad Perushei Alea Ishit. He says this is uh, the method of interpretation, the foundation of which I have personally chosen. This is the most upright and correct method which is present before God, meaning out of all of the methods that Borei Olam graced us with, at least in his time period, this is the one that appears to be most correct to me. Asher mimena levado ira. This is the path through which I hold the most reverence towards the Torah. Velo esaf ani Torah, and I don't show favoritism regarding the Torah in this method. In other words, it's an equal opportunity method of interpretation. It does not discriminate against boring passages or exciting passages. It's like the Gemara in Eruvin says that a person should never say shmua zu na'ah, shmua zu mekunah. A person should never say that certain portions of the Torah are my favorite and others are not. Everything is equally special according to this method. So he says this method is that of searching for the grammatical accuracy of every word with all my might. And in light of the proper grammatical rendition of the verse, I will then explain or expound upon the pasuk according to the best of my abilities. בפירוש המילה הראשונה תמצאנה. Regarding any word whose meaning you seek out, you will find the interpretation or the definition of the root that serves as the basis of a word in Hebrew the first time it appears. So Ibn Ezra is very careful to do this, and many Mefarshim follow in his footsteps when they define words for us by using the first context in which it appears as the paradigm. Right? כפירוש שמיים תמצאנו בפירוש הראשון. So he says that we find this example in, excuse me, we find this example I'm not sure what he's referring to, actually. I apologize. Maybe someone can help me out here. Okay. ועל זה המשפט כל הלשון. And nevertheless, he says regarding this methodology, you will apply this methodology to every word as it appears. ולא אזכיר טעמי אנשי המסורת, excuse me. I will not, meaning in his commentary to the Torah. Ibn Ezra is telling you, I'm not going to provide meaning or elucidation to the Ba'alei HaMesorah. The Ba'alei HaMesorah were those Chachamim who preserved the spelling and content of the text of the Torah as we have it. Hence the term, the Masoretic text, right? That comes from the Ba'alei HaMesorah, the bearers or the torch bearers of the transmission. Transmission being the exact spelling and content of the text of the Torah. What does that mean? So he says, I'm not going to go into lama zot mele'ah, velama zot nechseret. I'm not going to offer unfounded interpretations of why a word is not spelled maleh or chaser. For those unfamiliar, that refers to words which can be read without the fill-in letters. For example, The word Aharon can technically be read without the second to last vav, with the cholam, with the dot on top. It's quote unquote redundant. If I don't have that vav, I'm perfectly capable of still reading Aharon. The word Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is another very good example of this, where I could read Yerushalayim, chaser. If the second to last letter, the yod, which is second to last, is missing, I know that's referring to Yerushalayim. It just happens to be that these two words are not usually spelled chaser, they're usually spelled maleh. And so because of that, the Chachamim pick up on the instances where a word is usually spelled one way, but here it's spelled a different way, and there are all sorts of derashot that are formed off of that. Because all of the reasons offered for why a word is spelled one way in location X in the Torah, and why it's spelled differently in, I don't know, the book of Melachim, are all homiletical. They're not based on grammar or the straightforward rendition of the Torah. They're not based on peshat. There are times where the verse will write a word fully spelled out, right? Aharon with a vav. Sometimes it'll have it spelled that way. And sometimes a word will just simply be missing a fill-in letter in order for brevity, right? And after the rabbis expound upon the reason for this discrepancy in the spelling, they will then inform us of how we go about writing our Sifrei Torah, our Sifrei Nevi'im, and so on and so forth. And he gives you the example of Moshe katav belo vav. He wrote Adonai imloch. You can look up the verse in Shemot, Exodus chapter 15. Uma'atik Mishle, whereas the redactor of the book of Mishle, you'll notice, it's an important side point. He says, Ibn Ezra says Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah. He doesn't say who wrote Mishle. He says the redactor of Mishle. Right? That's because the Gemara refers to Mishle as a work of Shlomo HaMelech, Chizkiah HaMelech, and their subsequent schools. But there was no single composer to Mishle. There is a single composer to the Torah, though, contrary to what some academics want to claim in Ibn Ezra's name. Here you see pretty clearly that he doesn't believe that there were multiple composers to the Torah. Okay, so I digress though. But in Mishle, Yimloch is spelled with a vav, where Tachat kol eved Yimloch, or sorry, Tachat eved ki Yimloch. Excuse me. And here Yimloch is spelled Maleh. It's spelled with a vav. So is Yimloch, what is the objectively correct way of spelling Yimloch? Ibn Ezra says both are correct. It's simply a matter of maintaining proper tradition as the scribes have passed them down. But there isn't anything that is inherently correct or incorrect about a particular spelling, even though there are midrashim at times that comment on the significance of the spelling. He gives you further examples, Veshanim Rabot Ben Shnehem, and he says that there were many years of time between the composition of the Torah and the composition of Mishle. So it's natural, Ibn Ezra says, for the spelling to vary. But the reasons offered by the Chachamim for why they are spelled with the full transliteration, in other words, with a added vav or with an added yod, and why sometimes it's missing, it's good for toddlers. It makes for good toddler talk. So And that goes back to the warning I gave about Ibn Ezra last week, that he could be very critical, sometimes a little too critical. There is one problem with Ibn Ezra's theory, and if anyone can maybe enlighten me, I'm open to being enlightened. There are times where these sort of midrashim have ramifications in halakha. There are halachot that are learned out because a word is spelled one way and not another way. One example of this is the halakha of a sukkah's required walls. So the Gemara in Sukkah says that the verse in Sefer Vayikra, Basukot teshevu shivat yamim, Sukkot is not spelled with a vav. There's a vav missing. It's spelled baskat if you read it as is. And the Gemara says that teaches us the dimensions of, or the required walls needed for sukkah. It could be shaped like a bet, so 3, right? Could be shaped like a 4 walls or a circle. It could be shaped again like 3 or 2.5, or excuse me, yeah, like 3, and then tav 2.5. So you could claim that's a mnemonic. It's an asmachta. It sounds like a cop-out though to me. So I don't know, because there are other examples where the Gemara does take the spelling of words quite seriously. One other side point that I would like to point out is that of a Torah's spelling in light of the way we have the Baalei HaMesorah transmitted to us. So let's say you're reading from a Torah and your reference book, Sefer HaMesorot, which there are numerous copies of nowadays. The most authoritative, of course, is that of Harambam, where Harambam mentions the way the parshiot, the paragraphs of the Torah, are broken up, but he doesn't always give you spelling, because the spelling is incidental. So the Meir Todros Halevi Abulafia of Spain composed a work in the 13th century where he outlines the in his view the authoritative spelling of our Sifrei Torah based on some very old Sifrei Torah that he had at his disposal in Spain. The name of the work, for those who are interested, is called Mesoret Seyag LaTorah. So I even refer to it till today. It's a very valuable resource. And the question comes up very often: what if a Sefer Torah is missing a letter where there's supposed to be one? So each person should consult their own rabbi, but there's a very interesting comment that the Rama makes in Shulchan Aruch. He writes that the Talmud itself gives us a canon. Ein anu bekein becheserot v'iterot. We are not masters in what is considered maleh and chaser. That tradition already has been tainted. It's imperfect. So the Gemara has that canon stated in a few places. And basically, what it means is when the Masoretes, when the transmitters of the spelling of the Torah pass down the spelling to us as we have it, they are doing so completely 100% perfectly in content. That's why you will not find any discrepancy in content between my Sifrei Torah here in Philadelphia and Sifrei Torah in the UK and Sifrei Torah in Eretz Israel. But, says the Rama, you may find differences in spelling. You may find Shavuot spelled once with a vav, once without. You may find Aharon, as the example that we gave earlier, spelled with a vav where it's not supposed to be there, according to the way the Masoretes have transmitted. The Rama says that is not posel a Sefer Torah. It doesn't invalidate a Sefer Torah, not only because of the Talmud's canon of we are not experts in what is considered full spelling and and missing spelling, but also it touches on Ibn Ezra's point over here. The significance is doesn't affect content, right? Okay. Ve'im dalak bimkomot acherim midrashim. Oh, I skipped. I'm sorry. Gam beferushim haisharim en tzorech letikun sofrim. Ibn Ezra says also with regard to what is called tikkun soferim. Tikkun soferim refers to words which are, I don't like saying this, but it is what it is, words that are redacted. So the best example of this that I can give is in the Kelalot. In the Kelalot of the Torah, you have God will plague us with, God forbid, families being killed and torn apart, and the one's wife will be taken by the captors. Ve'ish acher, we say yishkavena. Another man will lie with her. The written text of the Torah doesn't say that. It says ve'ish acher yishkalena, which, if you know Hebrew, you know what that means, but we don't say that. So that is what is referred to as tikkun soferim. The redaction of the text in the way that it is read, not in the way that it is written. The written form is preserved, but there are certain things that we don't say. There's another example, although not everybody agree. There's a debate in the Rishonim regarding this, but according to some Rishonim, when Moshe Rabbeinu says to God, petitioning to have him spare Am Yisrael after the Egel HaZahav, what does Moshe Rabbeinu say? He says, "Ve'ata im tisach hatatam." You must spare the Jewish people of their iniquity, v'im ayin, because if not, mechenina b'sifercha asher katavta. Erase me from the book that you have written. So that's in reference to, obviously, on a simple level. It's in reference to Moshe Rabbeinu saying, kill me. Like, I don't want to see my people destroyed, and I'm the only one who remains. It's not fair. But there are some who say Moshe Rabbeinu himself was doing a tikkun soferim. He was, so to speak, saying, God forbid, we don't want your Torah. But that can't be said. So kill me. Okay. The Aramaic translator, that's in reference to Onkelos. Targum Onkelos, who translated the Torah into Aramaic, translated, elucidated correctly. Ubier lanu kol ne'emet, and he elucidated for us all those hidden things. In other words, where there is an ambiguity in the Torah that would prevent us from reading the text in a straightforward way, Onkelos steps in and he helps us with cryptic context, with poetry, like in Parashat Ha'azinu, in Vezot HaBeracha, and also with ambiguous words. Good example of that is, just one that comes to mind, when Bilam goes about his attempt to curse the Jewish people. It says Vayelech Shefi. In one of these instances, he went about Shefi. What is Shefi? I don't know what is Shefi. It's not a word that appears anywhere, at least not explicitly. So Onkelos says that he went bil chodohi. He went alone. He didn't go with Balak this time. He went alone and went about his inquiry of Borei Olam by himself to see if that would work. Okay. So there are many examples like this, and it's very, very important to be mindful of that when we are doing Shinai Mikra. When those of us who read the Torah every week with the Onkelos, pay attention to those elucidations. And if there are instances where Onkelos very passionately goes about rendering a pasuk in light of the midrashim, meaning he's not interpreting words for you straightforwardly, which he does sometimes. He does that from time to time. That the rendition will not be straightforward. It will be, for lack of better terms, midrashic, allegorical. We know that he's not doing this to interloop or to sneak in a midrash when nobody is noticing. That's not onkelos. Onkelos is, as the Talmud phrases it, it is targum didan. It is our understanding, our the commonplace and widespread rendition of the Torah, even for school children to understand. So it must mean, or it must indicate to us that onkelos understood the etymology of a word better than we. We are the ones who are lacking, not he. And more often than not, if you study onkelos correctly, you will see that that is in fact the case. But, rak chafetz losif ta'amim acherim. Onkelos is not a word-for-word translation all the time. So it could be that he's adding some flavor or meaning to a passage in the Torah, like he often does with biblical poetry, Az Yashir, Vezora Bracha, Ha'azinu, like I mentioned earlier. Ki pshuto yevinuhu afilo haboarim, because even ignorant people can understand the basic peshat of these verses. So, in other words, Ibn Ezra is saying where a person doesn't have an inability to read a passage of the Torah at face value, but reading at face value is still not clear, then onkelos will add insights from the Midrash. But only because those insights serve to clarify what the text is saying. In other words, there are times where grammar alone doesn't solve all the problems. I can understand a verse with all the grammatical insight in the world at times, but if I don't know the nuances of biblical poetry, I'm not going to understand the context. So onkelos will often fill in those blanks for us, and yeah, that would qualify as a form of peshat according to his Ibn Ezra and onkelos's understanding. Kemo iro, that's in reference to the berachot that the tribes were given at the end of Parashat Vayechi. The pasuk says, who is it by? I think it's by, is it by Binyamin? The pasuk is, Oseri la gefen iro v'la soreka beni atono. Kibes bayayin lebusho v'dam anavim suko. So anyway, that pasuk refers to a donkey, right? Iro is donkey. He straddles his donkey. Shelo tirgemo, onkelos does not render that as keben aton. He is the progeny of the donkey. Instead, because that sounds weird, why would you want to be called the son of a donkey? So he says instead, onkelos says, V'targum b'nei Yevunun. He is the progeny, the descendant of those who are wise and understanding. Ve'atono, so how do you understand the literal definition of iro, donkey, to fit in over here? Shar ha'itun, it's the gate of donkeys. Okay, you have to know a little bit of history over here. Or excuse me, it's the gate of gathering. So what's going on over here? Very briefly, in ancient times, if you were somebody who was wise and understanding and intelligent, you used to serve in a public capacity as a shofet, for example, somebody who was on the Bet Din and dealt with matters of Torah in public and on behalf of the public. Historically, the Bet Din would convene by the entrance of the city, like we're going to God willing be reading in the Megillah, Mordechai Yashav B'Sha'ar HaMelech, right? Or you have by Lot, Velot Yoshev B'Sha'ar Sedom. So in all of these examples, Kol ba'e shar iro, right? All of these examples where the gates of the city are referred to because that is where people would straddle their donkeys. That is where people would enter the city, gather, discuss. And so when speaking poetically, it makes sense why this why this phrase was used. Go back to what we said earlier. Because in light of our loyalty to the Peshat, in light of this derash, our loyalty to the Peshat is not in any way compromised. We can explain this edition of the Midrash that Onkelos adopts to fit in with the Peshat perfectly well. Kishivim panim la Torah. Because you know what? This is also a phrase the Gemara uses from time to time. There are 70 facets to the Torah. Meaning what? Meaning, it doesn't mean you could just go ahead and interpret willy-nilly however you like. There are rules, there are parameters as we discussed. But within those rules and parameters, there are multiple plausible renditions. And so Onkelos, when he does this in the poetic passages of the Torah, shows us just how multi-layered, multifaceted, and complex interpreting 2 or 3 words can be. רק בתורות ובמשפטים ובחוקים, אם מצאנו שני טעמים לפסוקים, he says not so fast though. 70 panim laTorah, but if we have legal context in the Torah, so you're going through Parashat Mishpatim, Parashat Acharei Mot Kedoshim, Parashat Shofetim Ki Tetzeh Ki Tavo, all these parshiot that have tons and tons and tons of mitzvot in them. If we read the Pesukim, and we can go about deliberating what a mitzvah means, does it mean X or Y? And one interpretation of the mitzvah fits in well with the way that our Chachamim in the Talmud expound on, and the way they interpret a verse. Shayu kulam sadikim, for they were all righteous. Nishan al amitam bli safek biyadayim chazakim. We rely on their rendition of passing the true tradition to us without any doubt and with firm grasp, with firm hands. God forbid, should we ever come to the point where, because of our arbitrary interpretation, because we opine on a pasuk one way, and that way happens to align with the Karaites, with the Sadokim, God forbid for us to fall into their camp. Ki hatakatam, their transmission of halakha to us, contradicts or is in opposition to the written text, v'adiktukim, or to grammar. Rak kadmonenu hayu emet. Our ancestors of blessed memory spoke the truth, v'chol divrehem emet, and all their words are true. V'Adonai Elohim emet yanchet abdo b'derech emet. He ends off with a bracha, stating that, of course, we are all human beings and we are all fallible. We all make mistakes. Even the greatest of our chachamim at times may not have an answer for you. I love, for those of you who study Rashi, I love when Rashi says, Ve'eneni yodea perusho, ve'eni yodea mahu. Rashi will do this from time to time. He'll say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Dear reader, maybe you can figure this one out. Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, also in his Hakdama to Emunot Deot, says, if there are any readers in the future who will read this work and find areas where I have overlooked something, or I've made a mistake, or where I can improve, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically the gist of what he says. He says, I encourage you to make margins, make notes in my work to correct those mistakes or to add areas that I have missed. And Ibn Ezra says the same thing. May the Almighty Lord, who is of truth, guide his servant, the Ibn Ezra, b'derech emet, in the path of truth. And that's a bracha that I want to leave off with, that Ibn Ezra left off with, and that I hope all of us can emulate and follow. And with that, I leave the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Chacham. If anyone has any questions, comments, criticisms, they can unmute, raise their hands, right in the chat box also. I'll start off. So is essentially, on some level, his methodology is similar to the Malbim, who tries to find how every single statement of Chazal is really the pshat hapashut of the text, and really you can. That's how it's meant to be understood if you just understand grammar enough.
Yes and no. So Malbim, for those who are not familiar, I think his full name was Rav Michael Wisher. I forget his full name actually. But Malbim was a 19th century Chacham from Galicia, I think, who has a very, very elaborate perush on almost the entirety of Mikra. And he has a method of connect, as Ohad correctly said, a method of connecting the words of the Ar Chachamim to the Peshat, the straightforward understanding of the text. I don't think Ibn Ezra is necessarily set on that. And the reason for that is because he sets his standards with onkelos, number one, and number two, with those passages of the Torah that reflect law, that reflect mitzvot. So where the Torah is relating to us one of the 613 mitzvot, it must align with the tradition of our Chachamim, and we must interpret the Pesukim in light of that. Where something has nothing to do with law, you want to talk about, I don't know, the birth of Yaakov and Esav, Vaitortesu habanim bekirba, and the way they were raised, the way they grew up. So these passages have nothing to do with halakha. They're meant to impart a very important lesson to us, sure, but I don't think Ibn Ezra would say that the interpretations of those passages in Parashat Toledot, for example, are stuck, frozen in time with what the Midrashim or with what Agadot in the Talmud have to say. I don't think so. I think Ibn Ezra was pretty dismissive of that, if anything. And he was saying that where it could be understood properly, great. But those are not passages that our Chachamim shared with us to support Peshat. Does that make sense? Whereas the Malbim will go out of his way very often to connect those Midrashim to the Peshat. Sometimes bending over backwards doing so. I don't think that's...
I think that Ibn Ezra understands the Midrash Chazal as not being the Pshat many times, but that's part of the oral tradition when it comes to halacha. And when it comes to story, meaning the more narrative elements of the Torah, then we're not bound to it.
Correct.
And the Malbim tries almost by force to make all of it into the Pshat.
More often than not, yes. Another commentator who's very well known for that is Haketa ve'Kabbalah. Rabbi Mackelberg, I think was his name. Haketa ve'Kabbalah also very often does that. And to his credit, Hashem Yivarecheu, he did this because he was combating the reform. And the reform in his time basically tried to disconnect Torah shebichtav and Torah shebe'al peh from one another, and he really tried to show how the two are interconnected, even in the passages of the Torah that have nothing to do with law, with halakha. Chacham Fa'ur alav shalom once shared with me that he believes that is why Chacham David Nieto wrote his Mateh Dan. His Mateh Dan was not combating Karaites. There were no Karaites in Spain in the 18th century. He was using Karaites as a polite way of referring to the reform. So, for what it's worth.
I think even the Malbim is very much writing against the reform as well.
Yes. Actually, for those unfamiliar, hold on, I want to just remove the. There we go. The Malbim started writing early in his career on halakha. We have, I think, on the first like 6 or 7 simanim of Orach Chaim of Shulchan Aruch, the Malbim's commentary. Very, very fascinating insights. And the Malbim stopped his commentary to halakha because he felt combating the way the Reform are teaching our Torah to our young boys and girls is far more important for me to be invested in than focusing on halakha that's already being taken care of by rabbis. He already had rabbis who were teaching halakha. That wasn't lacking. What was lacking was proper Jewish education in studying Mikra, because there was a gap there was a void there, and guess who took advantage of it and started, unfortunately, perverting the Torah to our boys and girls. I think that's a very important lesson in history for us. Yeah, absolutely.
Because he writes other places about the methodology of Midrash? Meaning, is he discounting it completely, or is he saying there is no place for it right now because we're dealing right now with understanding the text, but there is a craft called Midrashic learning?
I'm sure Malbim
Not
doesn't.
necessarily Ibn Ezra, but
Oh, I'm sorry. He already addressed that. Ibn Ezra already addressed the fact that there is a sod ne'elam. There are deep and profound insights to various passages in the Midrash that uh, are meant to impart a particular lesson to the reader, but not everybody is capable or privy to those hidden meanings. Ibn Ezra very often in his commentary will say um, that there's a sod gadol regarding a certain verse, right? That's what he is referring to. If a verse, he says, contains a great secret, people love using this example of when Ibn Ezra refers to Sod Shnem Asar. That's in reference to the verse when Abraham and Lot are together. V'haknani az ba'aretz. The Canaanites were at that point in time in the land. So everybody loves to say, you see, what's the implication if the text says that Abraham and Lot were cattle ranchers in Canaan and the Canaanites were in the land then? It means to tell you that the author of the Torah was dealing with a reality where the Canaanim were not in the land. Otherwise, there would be no point in saying that the Canaanim were in the land then. So you can understand that when Ibn Ezra says that there is a secret of 12 relating to this, I have no idea, for the record, what Ibn Ezra means by that. I could theorize, but he's not alive. I can't ask him what he meant. So some theorize that that refers to the secret of 12 verses in the Torah that were not written by Moshe Rabbeinu, which has basis in the Gemara. There's an opinion in the Gemara that actually is of that opinion, but not regarding 12. It's regarding the last 8 verses. I don't think Ibn Ezra means that. I think Ibn Ezra is referring to something else entirely different, because it's in line with what he stated in his introduction. There are sodot ne'elamim regarding some obscure portions of the Torah that Chachamim comment on, and we're not always privy to what those insights are. It makes for a very mentally challenging but rewarding exercise if somebody has the time and energy with the proper chacham, with the proper teacher, to go through some of these difficult midrashim in your parasha study or independent study of midrash, and to really unpack and unravel what our chachamim were trying to reveal to us. It's a beautiful, beautiful work of art, but not for everyone.
right. And I think this is the question that you brought in the middle, is that, so I understand the pshat, I understand when we have halacha, so you have a set tradition, so sort of that
Yes.
imposes over the pshat. But then the areas of halacha, which is 90%, a majority of the Talmud, is where they actively generate, seemingly using playfulness of the words, which Ibn Ezra seems to have a very big issue with. So that's really where the question with his theory lies, no?
In
Meaning,
part, yes.
Ein Tachat Ein, he'll admit, okay, fine, listen, the pshat is Ein Tachat Ein, but the understanding is financial. Okay, that we have to understand it that way. But when it comes to, okay, now we're going to start playing with drashot, especially with the ones that you quoted, like, for example, the shapes of the letters, that's where his theory starts having difficulty.
I think his theory holds difficulty only regarding Maleh and Chaser. In that example, there are many drashot the Gemara has that uses the full or missing spelling of words for legal purposes. I don't know how Ibn Ezra deals with that problem. So to any listeners, that's your homework. Teach, yeah, I'm not only teaching, I learn from everyone. So if anyone can teach me, please let me know. But I don't think that Ibn Ezra would have a problem when it comes to, let's say, the Yod Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Bahim. I don't think Ibn Ezra has a problem with Kal Vachomer, with a Binyan Av. These are all different tools that Chachamim would use in expounding upon the application of a pasuk. So let's give one example. We'll give the example of eating matzah. So the Torah says, Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot. This is a very good argument Karaites have. How is it not a mitzvah to eat matzah all 7 days of Pesach? The Torah is very black and white. It's very difficult to get around this, by the way. If you read almost every single time that the Torah mentions the story of Pesach and the mitzvot relating to Pesach, it always says, eat matzot for 7 days. Even, funny enough, even in the pasuk where Chachamim say, we learn from here that matzah is only obligatory the first night of Pesach. The pasuk says that it will be on the 15th of the first month. Ba'erev tochelu matzot. On that evening, you shall eat matzot. The Chachamim from there learn that the first night is obligatory. So the Seder night, or if you're outside of Israel, the first 2 nights. And all the other days of Pesach, matzah is optional. It's reshut. Some Rishonim, by the way, are of the opinion that reshut means there's still a mitzvah to eat it, but it's not an obligation. Side point. So, but having said that, how do you interpret eating of the matzot to be optional from that verse alone, when the rest, just read the rest of that pasuk in Shemot Yud Bet. It says, Ba'erev tochelu matzot, ad yom ha'echad ve'esrim lachodesh ba'arev. Until the 21st, meaning that entire week. So for that duration of 7 days, till the evening of Mosai Pesach, you shall eat matzot. In other words, the Torah is giving us a length, a span of time during which we eat matzot. It doesn't say eat matzot only the first night. You didn't read the rest of the pasuk. So the Gemara deals with this problem. And the Gemara points out that in Parashat, I think it's in Parashat Re'eh, it says, Sheshet Yamim Tochal Matzot. You shall eat matzot for a duration of 6 consecutive days. And the 7th of that festive period will be a day of rest. It will be a Yom Tov. Here you have the canon, Shnei ketuvim hamachlishim ze et ze ad sheyavo hakatuv hashlishi yachriya benehem. So that's where we have the third verse. If you have 2 opposing verses, this canon of interpretation allows the Chachamim, not Joe Schmo, not me, not you. It allows the court to find a third verse to reconcile, to balance the scales, to be the deciding vote, if you will. And that's where we have the pasuk of Ba'erev tochelu matzot. Ba'erev, right? If I'm remembering the drasha correctly, I'm working off of memory. But the drasha states that Ba'erev tochelu matzot is specifying it's pinpointing a date for you. You shall eat matzot on this evening, the night of the Seder, until meaning until is now its own separate clause. The rest of the other days are also days of matzot, but they were not the days that the Torah pinpointed, which is why they're days of matzot. You could still eat matzot. There's possibly even a mitzvah to do so, but they are not obligatory because those days are not specified like the first night ones. So again, is that Peshat? Ibn Ezra would tell you, yeah, it is, because that's what the Ma'atikim transmitted to us. Even though to the naked eye, it doesn't appear to be the Peshat.
Makes sense. We have one last question in the chat box from Chini. Says, where and to what degree does a remez apply in Torah?
That's a very good question. So remez, difficult to translate. They often translate it as hints. More accurately, I think a remez refers to a suggestion. So that we find that term used by Chachamim when referring to, for example, Kiryat Shema. In Kiryat Shema, when a person is saying the Shema, it's forbidden for him to communicate by remez, the halakha says. You can't wink with your eye or speak in sign language. You certainly can't speak in the middle of Shema between verses, but even remez, the halakha says, should be avoided. So they are suggestions. They are cues that the Torah gives to us regarding certain passages that are not halachic in nature, and sometimes they are legal, they are halachic in nature. There's a machloket, there's a debate among the Rishonim as to how we treat remez, at least on the level of halakha. Is a remez something which can be binding upon us as if the Torah itself stated so explicitly? Or does it merely give a warrant for the Chachamim to institute, for the rabbis to institute a practice, an enactment, what have you, in place? What's a very good example of this? A good example of this relates to Purim. The Gemara asks, for example, you know what? I'm actually not sure if the word remez is used, but it's understood to be remez. Esther mina Torah minayin. From where do we know that Esther is mentioned in the Torah? The short answer is Esther is not mentioned in the Torah. Next question. But the Gemara is not asking that question. The Gemara is asking for the remez. Where is the suggestion that an episode of Queen Esther in the story of the Megillah, where is that suggestion mentioned in the Torah? And very creatively, the Gemara uses the pasuk V'anochi Aster Astir et Panai. It's in the Kelalot in Devarim 31, right? V'anochi Aster Astir Panai Bayomahu Al Kol Hara Asher Asa. So that pun, if you will, Esther Astir, right? That's the allusion to Esther in the Torah. The Gemara uses this as a means of justifying Esther being canonized. So that was a whole debate. The Chachamim, I mentioned this in my shiur on canonization that the Chabura has up. So the Gemara has a whole debate. How are we even allowed to add a holiday to the Torah? How are we allowed to not to the Torah, to the Jewish calendar? How are we allowed to incorporate and canonize books beyond that which was already included in the Torah? So this is the tool of remez. Remez allows for the Bedin to have sort of leeway in deciding when to incorporate something and when not to.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll close it for tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Chacham, thank you so much for a very insightful shiur, as always. We're looking forward for next time. And thank you very much.
To be continued. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.